Hey everybody, I am going through grading assignments and I realized that in our discussion of whether or not a government ought to protect the culture through policy, I read through several different answers and I tried to answer it in a video like this, but I just never was happy with it. I think I have an answer for you, or I think I have an addition to my 2-year-old video that you've already maybe seen. Should a government protect culture and traditions in a society? Yes, because if they don't, if a government does not take steps to make clear to the population, this is the language, these are the traditions, this is the history we stick to, we adhere to, maybe even this is the religion. That one's touchy, so I don't know. If a government doesn't do that, and there is no set way of being in that society that is preferable, then people can behave and do whatever they want. They can bring in or employ whatever traditions or beliefs or values they'd like. And that will destroy the coherent moral order that all humans crave. So if you don't have a society that has boundaries around it, as protected by the government, then it will turn into nothing. Multiculturalism, and it doesn't work. Multiculturalism doesn't work because it violates the precept of humans preferring coherent moral orders. And so if the government doesn't do it up front, what will happen is people will eventually crave it, and then they will vote in authoritarian parties to enforce it in a way that none of you will probably like, or me for that matter, right? And we can draw directly from our article. If the places mentioned in Haidt's article had been more proactive about saying, here's the language, here's the culture, here are the traditions, this is what we are in Denmark, in Netherlands, in Sweden, in Germany, in France, in Spain, Italy, the UK, this is what we are. And if that would have been done, and if they would have been much more careful about immigration policy, then you would not see these rising right-wing movements in the first place. Right. So clearly they didn't do those things, which is why this is all ramped up. So yes, governments should do it because it's avoiding another bad thing down the road that's worse. And if you do it ahead of that authoritarian response, you can be more targeted and more thoughtful and more nuanced in what ways you want to enforce these elements of culture without being overly restrictive about other things. So for example, just having thought about it briefly, I think every country should have a national language or a couple, and they should be kind of enforced. For example, we don't have a national language, but clearly English is the vastly predominant language in the United States. Should people be able to speak a different language while they're here? Yeah, I suppose. The problem is, if we don't have an official national language, how many different ways does our government have to use to communicate with people? I think practically speaking, it would be far better to say, all you new people coming into the country, all you new citizens, whatever language background you come from, here is a taxpayer-funded, right, here's an option, a taxpayer-funded series of classes where we will teach you the language so that you can interact with the political, economic, and social culture. You can become one of us and you can communicate with people around you. So as one example, I think that having a national language is appropriate, and not having one or enforcing one is probably likely to create more strife and problem and confusion than the alternative. And there's a whole lot more to be said about this topic. And especially about immigration, because in the 2 years since I made that last video, I have been fairly closely following immigration, primarily in Europe, more so than the US. Different circumstances, different geography, different cultural dynamics. And it's becoming a serious concern. The UK, Ireland, France, pretty much every European country has a substantial challenge where there is a growing number of domestic, local, right, citizens in that country that have serious problems with the immigration policy. They're very frustrated by it, and they're increasingly voting in more nationalist and authoritarian-esque groups, right, to address it, because it's not being addressed to their satisfaction by their current governments. Denmark has even taken Denmark is a very liberal, very progressive place, and they have taken probably the furthest steps to try to get people out of their country that they don't want anymore. And 20 years ago, this would have just been shocking to imagine. But consider that they had a guy named Geert Wilders. 20 years ago, he was on the fringe. He was a lunatic. He was a racist, fascist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant clown. Just a couple of years ago, he was elected prime minister. He didn't change. Society did. And their reception to his message changed. Many of you mentioned the Fidesz party and Viktor Orban. Now, they got voted out recently, just this last year, under circumstances. But don't make any mistake. Their policies won't be different. I think it's the TISA party, TISZA, the TISA party. They're center-right. They don't want immigration. They very much want to be Hungarian. They want to reinforce the Hungarian language. They very much want to reinforce the Catholic religion. So just because the Fidesz party is out and Viktor Orban, who is pretty undemocratic, is out of power, none of that stuff's going to change at all. So should countries enforce cultural traditions and standards? I think they should, because if they don't, look what's happening in Europe right now. They didn't. All those countries didn't have a coherent policy about, well, one, immigration, but also cultural protection. And now places like France, very liberal, very open, have very strict rules. They won't. It's all kind of directed at Muslims, but the banning of burqas or niqabs or even hijabs in public, no public representation of religion in any way. Can you imagine a woman getting arrested on the beach for wearing just like a full body outfit versus a girl next to her in a bikini and maybe without a top, not being hassled at all? Like France is, but it's understandable if you understand the deeper underlying problems, right? Because it's not just an outfit that covers a woman, it's about what that represents to the French people and how it represents something very different from what their values are. Go look up the burkini. It's kind of wild. Burkini, not bikini. So yeah. If a society doesn't have cultural traditions, if a society doesn't have a coherent identity, things will collapse. Social capital development will become impossible, and you'll get the exact kind of responses that Jonathan Haidt wrote about in his article. So yes, countries should take steps to protect their culture and their traditions, because if they don't do it at the outset when they have greater control, the authoritarians will do it for them later. And I'm not saying this as I want this to happen. I'm saying this as this appears how it just happens. So take your pick. Later.